Well, what I have done with the release of The Inconvenient Truth was so outrageous that I really had to do something to address it. I have a PhD in ecosystems analysis and worked for a number of years and led a multi-million-dollar research effort into the effects of global warming on our nation's ecosystems, and had a chance to talk with a lot of different scientists on this particular issue around the country. And while we are having global warming, the real basic science is showing probably that it's being caused by natural cycles. And the evidence that Al Gore presented in his Inconvenient Truth was so outrageous as far as its scientific truth and basis that I had to do something to address it. And what we did is we interviewed almost 24 different climate scientists, leading climate scientists in the world, to get from them exactly what their perspective on this particular issue is. And that's on the DVD. But that leaves the question then, why are they proposing this? If the evidence is so weak, as the DVD shows, that man is causing global warming, why is it being done? And then through a series of experts and politicians, I lay out the scenario that they're trying to achieve what is called global governance, and the climate change, the Kyoto Protocol, and other sundry things like it are the perfect way to begin to control the economies of the world. And that's very key, of course, in the whole role of global governance.
This is a hard issue for a lot of people to look at, sir. I think there are a lot of problems in our environment today. I do support some aspects of the sustainability movement if it encourages not interdependence on a central power structure like the UN, but more of a responsible, personal, individual choice to become not dependent on a central power structure or even the grid, but to be fully sustainable by our own means. I find that to be a little bit different than what they're proposing here. I'm seeing a lot of reports come out about a global tax. Gordon Brown has called for a new world order to combat climate change. What do you know about that?
Well, actually quite a bit. We've been studying this particular issue for quite some time and have gone to many of the United Nations meetings on climate change, and with the realization that this is a tool, and it's a very good tool to begin to capture, because our whole entire economy, every economy of every nation in the world depends upon the burning of fossil fuel. And it's the economy is directly related to how much you have in transportation and other sundry things that go back to power, electricity, and so forth. And if you have to reduce the amount of power consumption, then you actually reduce your economy. In the case of the United States with the Kyoto Protocol, it would have required us to reduce our economy by 30%. Now, we wouldn't have had that great an impact. We would have been able to find some alternative areas to do it, but nonetheless, it would have had a huge impact, trillions of dollars worth. It is estimated by at least anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 per year per family. It would have been enormous. And the question is it really necessary? First of all, is man causing global warming? And I think the resounding answer to that is probably not much. It probably has some feedback mechanism, because carbon dioxide, after all, is a greenhouse gas. But the overwhelming evidence, as depicted on this DVD, Global Warming or Global Governance, shows very clearly that we've had much warmer temperatures in the past, and it's very cyclic, and we are on the increase now in global temperature, and it's going to probably be actually very beneficial to both mankind and to the environment if we have more carbon dioxide and a higher temperature. Now, obviously, we don't want a real high temperature, but at the same time, there's not an evidence that suggests that it's going to continue to go on forever. And in the past 11,000 years since the last glacial period, we've had at least 6 times where the temperature has been greater than it is right now, and in some cases by the matter of 2 or 3 or 4 degrees more warmer than it is right now, and everything seemed to be fine. The polar bear survived and so forth during that period of time. Is not likely to be the catastrophic conclusion that Al Gore presents in his video.
So your take then on the reports that are coming out about the Arctic and Antarctica melting very rapidly?
Actually, in the DVD, we go into that in a fair degree of effort. There's plenty of evidence. In fact, the latest scientific results out this summer are showing that the Greenland ice cap itself, the interior portion, not the edges of it, but the interior portion is actually growing, and so is Antarctica. In fact, Antarctica right now this year is tied for the record ice extent. What that means is the largest area covered by ice. It's at a near maximum right now. Even though there has been tremendous ice calving and so forth in certain portions of Antarctica, overall the Antarctic ice sheet is growing and it's getting colder. And what we're seeing in Greenland is basically more or less a return of what it was in around 1200 AD, when it was a degree to a degree and a half warmer than it is right now, and the Vikings colonized Greenland. And where we're seeing the ice melting is where they were growing crops almost 1,000 years ago.
At this point in the show, I want to go ahead and play a really quick 2-minute clip from your DVD, Global Warming or Global Governance. This is a clip where you see Al Gore, a clip from the film Inconvenient Truth. An inconvenient excuse is something that's also been coined, talking about the correlation between the temperature and CO2. When we come back, I want to follow up on that topic with you, including some charts that we have and some articles about the entire solar system heating up at this time. We'll be right back. Keep it here on Outside the Box with our guest, Michael S. Coffman.
The major premise of the Inconvenient Truth is that carbon dioxide is the major greenhouse gas that drives the temperature of the Earth.
They can go back 650,000 years. Here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, well, let me put it this way. If my classmate from the 6th grade that talked about Africa and South America were here, he would say, did they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But they did, of course. And the relationship is actually very complicated, but there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer because it traps more heat from the sun inside.
The ice core data comes from ice cores drilled to a depth of nearly 12,000 feet, or 2.2 miles, at the Vostok Station in Antarctica. Like Mr. Gore, the United Nations uses this information to prove that Earth's CO2 and temperature are highly correlated. And they are right. However, a high correlation proves nothing. To give an extreme example, there is a 100% correlation that any human that breathes air will die. But that does not prove that breathing air kills people. Far from it. We would all die if we didn't breathe air. But even the correlation used by Mr. Gore and the United Nations is misleading. Notice they kept the two graphs separate. By doing so, the human eye perceives that CO2 causes temperature to rise. However, when the temperature graph is superimposed over the CO2 graph, it becomes apparent that CO2 tends to follow temperature, not precede it, strongly suggesting that the CO2 does not cause the temperature to change, but the temperature causes CO2 to change. This point was made extremely well by London, England's Channel 4 in a documentary they produced called The Great Global Warming Swindle.
Well, here we're looking at the ice core record from Vostok, and in the red we see temperature going up from early time to later time at a very key interval when we came out of a glaciation. And we see the temperature going up, and then we see the CO2 coming up. CO2 lags behind that increase. It's got an 800-year lag, so temperature is leading CO2 by 800 years.
So obviously, carbon dioxide is not...
I want to ask you about the structure of the IPCC, but before we do that, you want to make some follow-up comments to that, because I do want to talk about the sun briefly.
Yes, it's one of the things that I think is probably most in error in Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth is the fact that he makes this allegation, and the thing that really struck me, and it strikes many scientists, is that both the IPCC and Al Gore keep those two graphs separate so that the human eye sees that there is a correlation, but that the fact that temperature does tend to precede carbon dioxide either going up or going down, and as a consequence, it's more likely if there's a cause and effect relationship that temperature causes CO2 to increase when it warms or decrease when it cools. And there's a very good reason for that, and that's because the ocean itself, as it warms because of more solar radiation, will actually release more carbon dioxide because it cannot hold as much insolubility as it can when it's colder. And then when the temperature of the Earth begins to decline, the ocean is able to absorb more carbon dioxide, and therefore there is less in the atmosphere.
Do you think there's a possibility of a cooling effect?
Yes, in fact, there is a lot of scientists right now, and I'm not necessarily don't necessarily support this, but there is a number of scientists, especially in Eastern Europe and in Russia, that believe that we may be entering into another cooling period over the next 20 to 30 years. And there is evidence to suggest that, because it happened between 1945 and 1975. We actually declined in temperature substantially when carbon dioxide was escalating. Atmospheric carbon dioxide was escalating.
Jim, we got a couple articles up there that pertain to the developments over the past couple of years. The blasphemous scientists, some have called them, the ones that have decided to look at the whole pie instead of just the slice in terms of the universe or the solar system or the current galaxy that we reside in. Pluto, Neptune, Triton, which is a moon. It's very interesting to see all these different other parts of the solar system heat up. I want to go over some of these bit by bit. We'll just go through them. Global warming on Pluto puzzles scientists. New storm on Jupiter, hints of climate change. National Geographic, melting Mars means man-made global warming a myth. Monster storms seen on Saturn. Global warming detected on Triton. These are all mainstream publications. Now, did you have any follow-up to that?
Yes,
in terms
fact,
of the sun?
it's one of the things that I think a lot of us have been following is because the whole entire solar system is warming up. All the planets and especially the moons and so forth, the Jupiter, which are large enough to have this kind of an effect. But we're seeing the polar ice caps of Mars melt, the moons of Jupiter warm up, Saturn and so forth, with these storms that are indicative of the fact that it's becoming warmer, which suggests that something's happening within the solar system, not just on planet Earth, that's causing the warming on planet Earth. And of course, the one thing that we all have in common is the sun.
And the sun affects us in what way? We know on what way. There's satellites and cell phones, but in terms of the planet, I haven't heard enough talk about that. And that's exactly the thing that makes me suspicious of the IPCC and this branch of the UN. We're also engaged in a war on terror, Coffman, as you know, and we see some similar individuals that are engaged in some of these behind-the-scenes activities with the war on terror in the military-industrial complex, i.e. the Bilderberg Group and the Trilateral Commission, both groups pushing for this specific view of climate change and proposing now a global carbon tax, which Bush has now put his support behind just last week.
Yes, in fact, it's very disturbing that we see the exact recommendations from the Commission on Global Governance, which is the United Nations Commission back in the 1990s, recommended that we have these kinds of pollution taxes. They specifically mentioned the carbon tax for global warming and a number of other things, which Al Gore and these other organizations, like you say, the Bilderbergs and the Trilateral Commission, are pushing very hard. Again, if you see what these recommendations actually do, is that they give external control over our internal sovereignty and our economy, and this is what is highly disturbing, because they're using global warming as a surrogate issue to actually show the reason why they think, or trying to convince us that we must do what they're saying in order to save ourselves. And it's just not necessary. It really isn't. The issue isn't that man is causing it. The issue is that we're having warming, and we need to adapt to it. Why we're having the warming is very likely, again, because of the sun, for two reasons. One is the direct solar impact. We've had, since the 1700s, we had what we had called the Little Ice Age in the 1700s, where it was almost 1.5 degrees colder than it is right now. It's when the Thames River in London froze over every year, and they used to have ice parties, when they had severe storms in the North Atlantic that wiped out coastal villages and so forth, because it was much colder at that period of time. We had massive diseases and starvation because they had crop failures. I mean, it was a horrible time to live, but we've been warming up ever since then, and we're part of that warming right now. And the reason why is that the astronomers first discovered was that there was almost no sunspots back in the 1600s and 1700s, almost none. And since that time, they've been gradually increasing, especially through the 19. It's getting late here, and I'm drawing a blank here. The last century, the 20th century, yes. The 20th century, the number of sunspots have increased dramatically, and they plotted the Earth's temperature over the number of sunspots that they've seen every year, and amazingly, there is a high correlation. Now, that doesn't mean there's a cause and effect, but it's something to look at. And what they found is that when you have more sunspot, the sun is actually emitting more radiant energy, but not enough to cause the temperature to change here on Earth like it has. So there's something else going on. Now, that may have an effect on Mars and Jupiter and so forth, it's direct solar radiation, but it wasn't quite enough to explain what's happened here on Earth. What they found over the last 15 years, and they've actually known about it kind of indirectly for longer than that, is that cosmic radiation, which occurs because of exploding stars millions of light years away, eventually reach the Earth. And what they found, and there's almost 100% correlation on this, that when you have more cosmic radiation, there is more lower cloud formation at the low elevations. With those low clouds, there is more solar reflection off of those clouds, less reaching the Earth's surface, therefore the Earth cools. When there is more solar activity, there's more solar flares, there's more solar storms, there's more sunspots and so forth, what happens is that you have more solar winds. These solar winds push back these cosmic rays right out of the solar system. Not entirely, of course, but there's far fewer of them reaching the Earth's surface because the sun is more active. Therefore, there is less cloud formation, less reflectance, and therefore more solar energy actually reaching the Earth's surface and a warmer Earth.
Oh boy, amazing. I have a couple of things that I want to go over with you before we let you go. First of all, I have some questions about, briefly, if you could sum it down, what your perception is, what your research has led you to discover on your own about the New World Order, what it is, for one thing, and how this involves the IPCC. Let's go over first the structure of the IPCC, and then I want to get your perspective on what you think is going on here.
Well, the IPCC is an international organization, part of the United Nations, that was formed back in the early 1990s after the alarm was that we had global warming. Their primary responsibility was to be able to use science to define exactly what's going to happen. But there is no oversight of this organization, and as a consequence, corruption has settled in. In fact, the whole organizational structure actually encourages this kinds of corruption because it's the politicians that are in control of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change.
There isn't a consensus on global warming when it comes to scientists, correct? I mean, like I said, it's almost been considered blasphemous to question as if it's Holocaust denial. There have been people, like you've said, in Germany, in Britain, all around Europe and the U.S. that have looked at the sun's involvement in what's happening, and they're not involved in the discussion.
Absolutely, and the fact that they're claiming consensus, and there really literally isn't. At least half of the scientific community that is qualified to address this particular issue does not believe that there is sufficient evidence to suggest that man is causing global warming. That is not consensus. That is literally not consensus. And many of the people who believe that man is causing it are getting these huge grants, million-dollar grants, from the federal government or from other governments around the world to prove that there is this man-caused global warming. And, of course, that's a huge incentive to slant your research, and I'm sorry I just have to say this, but science is being corrupted in this process.
It's terrifying. It's terrifying because people think that this is the change that we've been waiting for, and there are other environmental issues that are looming that are actually here right now. And I actually want to ask you about that. What is your take on the environment in terms of things that we should be looking at in terms of deforestation, for that matter? And also there's the whole issue of the tampering with DNA all over the world, from both human animal embryos to genetically modified food, or also modified or mutated species, genes that can jump the species barrier.
You know, there is a lot of environmental issues that we need to be looking at, including the genetic issue. I'm not a qualified geneticist, so I can't address that specifically, but I'm very concerned about gene manipulation, because when you get down to that level, you can start unleashing issues that may not show up for 20 or 30 years, And we have seen in crop science, for instance, strains that have done beautifully for a number of generations and then all of a sudden have faced a huge collapse because they're susceptible to something that's never been a problem before. So this, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, it's just that we should be much more cautious about it, especially in this cloning issue.
Is there anything else that you have your focus on in terms of the environment and things that aren't being brought up?
Well, I think one of the issues that I think all of us are concerned about is pollution, that we need to be very concerned about pollution and to develop technology and utilize technology that's going to minimize pollution, including perhaps even carbon dioxide emissions, although the overwhelming evidence at this point is that more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to be hugely, hugely beneficial to both mankind and to the ecosystems, because carbon dioxide is a primary gas that we need to have life. That's what provides the food material for plants themselves. The more carbon dioxide you have, the more plant growth you're going to have, the more crop production. In fact, we've already noticed a 9 to 12% increase in crop production over the last 30 years because the carbon dioxide is increasing. If you double it, it could increase up to 20 to 40% increase in food production. That's a huge amount. Ecosystems will be healthier. There will be more diversity, biodiversity. You name it, it's all related back to carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide right now is very limiting to plant growth.
You know, I think I want to get the documentary filmmakers of Who Killed the Electric Car on the show at this time, because when I look at this whole situation with oil, which truly can destroy an economy when hyperinflation takes effect. I mean, for example, just look at Burma and what happened there. They all came out, monks that would normally never protest, because the price of oil jumped 500%. We know how they control this monopoly. There's people proposing that man is causing global warming are not in any way effectively creating free energy systems that are interdependent, that are separate from a corporate entity, trying to, of course, monopolize that as well. I've seen these green commercials produced by Chevron on the television, and I have no faith whatsoever in these same monopolies bringing me the solution.
Unfortunately, you're absolutely correct. Again, they're part of the problem. Now, not everyone, obviously, that works for Chevron or works for Exxon or works for these other companies are involved in this. In fact, even the upper management probably really doesn't understand what's going on. They're just looking at it as a business opportunity. But there are key people in these multinational organizations, as well as the banking and financial institutions around the world, that are very definitely pushing these particular agendas because it gives them more control.
Well, my suggestion is for those people watching, if you're really concerned about this no matter what, and nothing's changed your mind in terms of looking at science, at the very least, never give up the fight, the push for free energy, a different energy system that is different than the system that we are on today. And you can actually find bonesmen. In fact, some of you actually know what that means, bonesmen, in the early development of the fossil fuel industry. You also find Rockefeller out there and how he really made it with his launch of Standard Oil. Our last question for our guest before we let you go, real briefly, what is the New World Order? What is global governance? How are we going to be able to see this manifest in the future if what you're saying is accurate?
Well, one of the things that we need to understand is, of course, there have been tyrants all through history that have wanted to capture the world and rule the world. This is nothing new. What we're seeing now is that there's this global consortium or cartel, as it were, and it's very flexible. It's not this lockstep monster trying to gobble us up. What they're doing is that they're trying to use different ways, and what they have arrived at is, it was started during the Clinton administration, and I'm not just pointing the finger at the Clinton administration. They're all involved. What we're finding is this new partnership, this public-private partnership, where you have government forming partners with industry, forming partners with what's known as non-governmental organizations. And what this means is that you create this monopoly of a few key companies that have control over certain aspects of our economy, because they're government sanctioned, and any small company that wants to get into the field can't do it because they're restricted, because the government is passing all these regulations and so forth that will keep out the small fry or gradually ruin their competitors and so forth. And what you've seen here is a gradual controlling of our economy through these public-private partnerships. Most people are unaware that even in the United States, huge sections of freeways, and not freeways, that's a misnomer, turnpikes and so forth, are being taken over by foreign conglomerations. They're not owned by American companies anymore. They're not owned by the state. They're not owned by the federal government. They're owned by Spanish companies, for instance. There's a huge
Juan Carlos.
effort. Pardon?
Juan Carlos.
Yes. Down the Trans-Texas corridor, for instance, is going to be controlled and owned by a Spanish company. A huge thing, and the state itself cannot build any competitive roads for a 50-year period. I mean, this is horrifying when you realize that these public-private partnerships are literally taking over this nation, and we're going to be controlled by a government elite that is not accountable to the American people, because none of the politicians have a voice in it. It's all done by bureaucracies and bureaucrats, along with companies and non-governmental organizations like the Sierra Club and other types of organizations like that.
Here are a couple of headlines this week for the economy. Foreclosure filings nearly double. Unemployment edges up despite new jobs. Weak dollar prompts record foreign buyouts of U.S. companies. And as mentioned before, Vincetti Fox admits plan for single NAFTA currency. There's so much happening with the news these days that most people can't even take a look at one of these articles. It hurts people.
It really does. It really does. The North American Union, or the SPP as it's properly called right now, is another example. This was being planned back in the 1950s. I have evidence to suggest that it was actually being planned in the 1950s to divide the world up into economic blocks or economic regions. Eventually, in 1973, they said there would be 10 of them. And what we're seeing here right now, today, there's 8 of them being formed. The North American Union is happening right before our eyes, but most people don't even realize it. And as Vicente Fox just said a couple days ago, they're going to be introducing the Amero here very shortly as a new currency.
Well, In Game is a documentary film that's going to be coming out soon that tackles a subject that you have also mentioned, Agenda 21. Tell us a little bit about that before we let you go.
Well, Agenda 21 was created back in 1992 at the Earth Summit at Rio de Janeiro, and it basically is a 40-chapter document that just is amazing. It is literally amazing because it covers every aspect of our life. It calls for the control of everything that we do, what we eat, how we go about our business, where we live, that kind of thing. It literally establishes the need for government to control every one of these aspects. It is a purely socialistic document in which government has absolute control over our lives. And they're implementing that as we go along right now. It's being implemented both environmentally and socially. It is a horrifying document when you realize the impact of what it is. And what they're doing is that they're using international treaties to give the international authority to do this. And no longer will the United States have the ability to have itself governed, because we are under so many of these international treaties. These are interlocking international treaties. And it's like the Lilliputians with Gulliver's Travel. Eventually, there's going to be so many of them that we won't be able to move.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on. Hopefully we will be able to talk again. Your website, Global Warming, globalgovernance.com. Thanks for coming on, sir.
Thank you.